certainly not in the colonial times and not now, that when protests erupt, they achieve nothing. In fact, that's not the case. Is that right, Anthony? Could you just sketch for us a little bit the way that this is not something new, and then we'll also talk about the ways in which this is new.
Absolutely. I mean, this is very clearly a continuation of a long history, a sort of the end of a continuing narrative arc of political protest in Hong Kong, in particular in the post-handover years, though of course it has a long history going back way before that. I think Joshua has already quite eloquently spoken of how the current protest movement has been an outgrowth, a development of the umbrella movement of 5 years ago, but we can even go back to a very similar parallel back in 2003, the Article 23 anti-subversion law controversy.
Regina knows a lot about that.
Regina will know well, which is a very similar situation. The government proposed to introduce the law. The people came out into the streets en masse to protest against it, and they were successful, and the government ultimately withdrew that law. So a very similar thing to what we saw happen here. We saw a similar successful protest campaign when Joshua again led the campaign against the national education curriculum, a proposal by the government to introduce a compulsory patriotic education campaign to Hong Kong schools, which again was withdrawn. The umbrella movement wasn't successful in the sense that it didn't achieve its aims, but it certainly was a significant political awakening for Hong Kong's younger generation, produced future leaders such as Joshua, and enabled them to develop their strategies and their tactics for protest, which we're seeing now on the streets over the past few months. So it's really a continuation of that arc.
Go back further. At the last time that the major power from the north threatened to invade Hong Kong was 1967, when actually the Communist Party of China instigated riots here in the territory. And just to put some things in context, that period, it was nearly a year, was significantly more violent than so far. 51 deaths, hundreds of bombs planted by.
You need to ask me. I was there.
Please, well, I would tell me about it, and tell me how Hong Kong has been.
I have lived through more riots than Joshua knows, and use of emergency regulations.
Well, now some of the bombers who went to prison under colonial times have ended up with the Golden Order of the Bauhinia. So I just wonder whether Joshua might draw the same conclusion that, in fact, if he protests now, he will, in some future regime, be honored for it.
I doubt that very much.
Bonnie, could I ask you, as one of the organizers of the mass protests, accurate numbers are hard to come by, but let's just say 2 million for the biggest march.
Right.
Many people I've spoken to taking part in protest have said that they don't actually expect change. The topic of Anthony's book is that actually change does come about, including after the leftist riots in 1967. There were major social changes to education, improved education, housing, working conditions, and so forth. The protests, when you were the Secretary for Security, actually caused the shelving of the anti-sedition bill. So is it the case that protest and violence, even violence, and we'll talk about violence separately in a minute because I think we need to grapple with this issue about the legitimacy of it, but is it the case that it can actually change things? Because if we think that it can, well then we can start to imagine a slightly more hopeful future.
Well, I very much hope so, because if 2 million people, almost a quarter of Hong Kong population, took to the streets, angrily chanting slogans to the Hong Kong government and still doesn't make a change, who else would love to live in such a city? And especially why we see so many clashes happening here in Hong Kong is because Hong Kong people do not see hope. We see on the 9th of June, that is our first million people march, we had only two demands. That was withdraw the extradition bill and Carrie Lam to step down. If at that time, after 1 million people took to the streets, after we announced the number, if the government immediately respond to people's voices and withdraw the bill, we'll probably very happily go home and sleep. And then afterwards, they decided to carry on as scheduled. So a few days later, people took to the streets again, circulated the Legislative Council, and forced a number of people risk their life risk their future, risk 10 years of imprisonment to physically stop the pro-democracy, pro-government, pro-Beijing legislators from entering the Legislative Council, to stop them voting, to stop them starting of the debate of the extradition bill. And so the clashes that we see here in Hong Kong are forced by the Hong Kong SAR government's tyranny. And the clashes that we see now in the streets are actually reactions to the government totally unaccountable to Hong Kong people.
Regina, I'm going to give you a full chance to
Yes,
respond
yes.
to that in a second, but I just want us to focus on violence first of all. One former legislator said that, who was a colleague of yours, told me after the end of the march on Tuesday, the peaceful rally that it ended in Central, it was illegal, but it was peaceful, that he hoped that some of the more radical, more violent protesters would restrain themselves, because now was the time to find political discourse and dialogue, particularly with the district council elections coming up. But one thing he did point out is that actually the violence worked. That's to say, if protesters had not invaded LegCo, then the anti-extradition bill would not have been shelved and then withdrawn. So I just would like to ask the audience now about this. I, like many of my colleagues, are concerned about violence and about where this might lead. And I, as a Brit, a half-Irish Brit, am concerned about the parallels with Northern Ireland, because it was in the late 1960s that a very large section of society in Northern Ireland felt that it was deprived of civil and political rights, the Catholics. The protests were at first peaceful. They were answered with tear gas. That forged a unity among the Catholics, and violence escalated. 3,000 or so people died during the so-called Troubles. Certainly, my growing up was very much coloured by that, with bombs on the mainland Britain, as well as, of course, in Ireland, and violence against politicians, as well as ordinary people. You've all got these paddles, these yes and no paddles. Who thinks that the risk is quite high of the violence escalating to, for instance, the violence that Hong Kong saw in 1967, something like 2,000 people injured, 51, correct me if I've got the figure, 51 deaths. Who is concerned that there could in Hong Kong be a prolonged period of that kind of violence? Please raise your hands or your paddles. And well, the concerned outnumber the unconcerned by a fair proportion. Regina, could I ask you please to tell me your views and thoughts on violence, which I think many people in the room would argue has taken place on both sides, and this would then be the occasion to for all of us to sort of find ways forward, how to come back from the brink, and how to find a meeting.
Well, I agree with Dominic.
Anthony.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Anthony, that this is a continuation of Occupy Central. But Occupy Central was relatively peaceful under the guise of civil disobedience. But on day one, 9th of June, the peaceful demonstration of large numbers of protesters quickly degenerated into road blockages and attacks on LegCo. And then it's a continuation of violence and escalation of violence. I have actually been talking to experts, who have dealt from Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. They've been sharing the Northern Ireland experience with me. And what's happening is what started in 2014 as civil disobedience, is now turning into riots, terrorism, even insurrection. Because look at what the latest demands, it's not really about the extradition bill or the 5 demands. People are calling for disbandment of the police, disbandment of government, taking over Hong Kong, handing over back to the US. I really reject Joshua's argument that we are a global center, so we could ask the US to help. So is New York, so is London. Does it mean that those governments should account to other shareholders and stakeholders in their city? That's not a valid argument. Now there are lots of calls for dissolution of our government. Proclaiming Ma On-shan to be independent is very dangerous.
There are all sorts of demands,
Really?
Regina, but there's been surprising consistency about these 5 demands. Universal suffrage doesn't seem too bad to me. What's wrong with that?
I'm a constitutionalist. To get universal suffrage, being a part of China, we must proceed in accordance with our constitution. In fact, I debated that with a senator last week about why is Beijing not giving us universal suffrage now? Well, the basic law says very clearly that is the ultimate aim, in accordance with 2 principles, orderly and gradual progress, and in the light of actual situation of the day. Frankly, as you know, we have district councils elections coming up very soon. I'm supposed to help my candidates. But did you know that full details of my home address and those of 43 pro-government legislators have been uploaded on LIHKG? I fear for myself. I don't want corrosive acid to be thrown at me or fireballs. I've been speaking up against violence, you know. Do we have the right conditions for universal suffrage right now?
Well, I would say that China has made 4 appalling choices of chief executive so far.
I don't dispute that, frankly.
This could hardly be worse.
Better choices could have been made, you know.
On this subject, I mean, we as journalists spend a lot of time trying to understand what China understands of Hong Kong. And when we meet Chinese officials, they are excruciatingly wooden in their sloganeering.
Yeah.
And of course, currently they accuse black hands of being behind all this strong feeling here.
There's a big cultural difference between
cultural
the way
difference,
they operate and we
there's
operate.
a cultural difference, but I mean, it's actually it's a factual claim, which is really quite a strong one. And I just wonder, I mean, do you and your colleagues tell them they're wrong? That's one question. The second question is, even if we assume that the Liaison Office and the Foreign Affairs Commission here in Hong Kong sort of have an idea of what's going on, although I'm not sure, because the Deputy Commissioner, he told me the other day that he absolutely didn't know anybody who had taken part in your marches, Bonnie, or who had any family members who've taken part. So that's rather a lot of Hong Kong people he's refusing to speak to. But anyway, it would be worrying if they don't understand Hong Kong. It would also be worrying if they didn't pass up their understanding to Xi Jinping and his people. Are they worried about passing up?
It's not easy for them to really find out what's going on in Hong Kong. They have a youth department. But would Bonnie talk to the youth department officials freely?
Well, I didn't have the.
Would you have
call.
qualms? You know, some of my colleagues have qualms about going to the liaison office. It's hard for them to contact other young people,
it's all done through
other than the wealthy ones and the privileged ones. You know, it's very
difficult.
difficult.
These organizations, and I mean, when Carrie Lam herself a few weeks ago said yes, it's important to speak to the youth, she went and addressed a PLA youth camp and spoke to them in Mandarin.
The Hong Kong government has the same problem. Their mode of outreach is to hold a youth summit once a year in the government secretariat.
Well, this is our youth summit as well. We're speaking for some of us in the room. So now, how to bring things back from the brink? Regina, you first, please.
I think I lived through many riots. I lived through 2 occasions when the emergency regulations were invoked. First time in 1967 when I was taking my equivalent of GCE O-level, you know. And then in 1973 when there was an oil price crisis, the government introduced emergency control of fuel price, you know, regulations, you know. In the US, people invoke emergency regulations far more often than we do when they have hill fires, when they have a hurricane. Recently, I noticed Los Angeles elected officials are asking the governor to declare emergency because of homelessness. Well, I'm not dodging the question, but what I think is, just as in the 1970s, after the riots, there were reforms. McLehose, I have a lot of respect for him. I work under him. He introduced radical reform. He started a 10-year housing program. We only had compulsory education for 9 years in 1979. Again, McLehose pushed that. and a network of cultural centers, music officers all over Hong Kong, because the Brits, my bosses, found out the depth of the anger. 1966 Kowloon disturbances, in 4 days, 1,465 people arrested, and several killed, many life rounds fired, deployment of police and military. That's why our police in such a difficult position, because they are all we have right now. Whether in 66 and 67, we have joint police military operations, plus auxiliary defense units.
There may be one difference, which is in 67, the police had the support of ordinary Hong Kongers, many of whom had fled communist China.
Yes, that's right.
Today, the police has lost the support of a very large proportion of... and that's part of the problem. And and some of your colleagues at Odexco also do acknowledge that this is an issue that has to be dealt with, that police get off scot-free, as do triad members.
The relationship has been broken. I do agree. And that started in 2014. It's hard to repair that sort of relationship.
We'll spend much of the rest of the session, which is not long, on repairing. Anthony, briefly, if you could tell me what you think needs to happen, and then I'll ask Bonnie.
Two points, and it follows directly on from Regina's point. After the 1966 riots, one of the first things the government did was to hold an independent inquiry into what had happened, the causes of the riots, and some of the solutions. And I think there's been many calls for an independent inquiry. I don't think we need to go through all the arguments, except to say that I think it's absolutely necessary to investigate what's happened here. Frankly, I think if there was an independent inquiry after the umbrella movement, after what it was that brought the city to a standstill for 79 days back then, we might have discovered many of the problems and had ways to address them.
Just very briefly, do you think there will be an independent
There were 2 studies after the 1966 riots,
But this time...
there was a much shorter study after the 1967 riots, because the British government thought it was a cultural revolution inspired. So they submitted a report to FCO. But after the current events are over, I do think there should be an in-depth study.
How confident are you there will be one?
I think I'm pretty confident. In government, we talk about post-mortem. You only conduct post-mortem after the event.
After the death.
After the death of the riots.
The other important point, I think, is this fundamental breakdown of trust. And what really concerns me about what's been happening here is we've had a government that's disappeared. We've had basically no government for the last 3 months in Hong Kong, the governance by the police only, and a systematic breakdown in the institutional trust, that people not only no longer trust the government and the police, they are losing trust in the MTR, in Cathay Pacific, in all these institutions that people relied upon and trusted. And that is really a fundamental threat, I think, to the long-term peace and prosperity of Hong Kong.
Okay.
Bonnie.
First of all, 5 demand, not one less, is chanted by 2 million people. I have no authority to say otherwise. It is not because Hong Kong people are unwilling to compromise. It's not because we're greedy, but because the ultimate goal, the universal suffrage, is already promised to Hong Kong people in the basic law. So it is our ultimate goal, and we will soldier on until we seal it. But if we're talking about how to release tension, I would say, agree with Anthony, the independent investigation, because now we are seeing that the Hong Kong police force are exercising the brutality. We are seeing that some police officers, the bad cops, blatantly breaking the law, caught on camera, and they're not facing any legal consequences, not facing fair trial.
Shades of Northern Ireland again.
And we cannot leave that there, because when somehow we leave the campaign and we go home, the absolute power will continue to corrupt absolutely, so we cannot leave it there. So a olive branch, please, Regina Ip, tell Carrie Lam to give us independent investigation.
Amongst the audience, who believes there should be, quite urgently, the promise of an independent inquiry? And no's, overwhelmingly yes. Could you pass that on to the Chief Executive?
I'm already fully aware of that. I think there should be a root and branch inquiry after things have quietened down, not now. And actually, after Occupy Central, 7 policemen were charged and jailed.
We are looking forward to the same happening.
But you have to wait for due process. You cannot just make accusations,
Well,
You have to-
I did not. I expect fair trial, but now we see that armed mobs hitting people caught on camera, we know their identity, and they're still
There are also
free in the
videos
streets.
of
And
policemen
police
being
officers as
attacked.
well.
So
you know,
we have
with
a
fire
question
bombs.
from one of our viewers online, which is about Hong Kong's tycoons who do seem to have a line into the chief executive's office. Would universal suffrage further empower Hong Kong oligarchs? Who would like to answer that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it. I mean, this is what's always amused me about Beijing's resistance to universal suffrage in Hong Kong, because if they've learnt anything from observing Western electoral politics, they'd know that it's always the rich and powerful and wealthy that end up calling the shots in open democratic elections, just by virtue of the resources that they can wield. So you would think that if Hong Kong did have an open, fully open universal suffrage system, the tycoons would still call the shots, and you'd have the same result as we have at the moment. So I do wonder what Beijing's afraid of.
But
Questions?
I think the silver lining is from the events, the current events. I think Beijing has learned that tycoons are not the best allies. You know,
They-
and that Hong Kong needs redistribution. We do need
Does
redistribution.
does the Hong Kong government have the political strength to really take on the tycoons? For instance, to introduce a Singapore-style housing system. For instance, when New World gives a bit of farmland up, farmland which it may not even have planning
It's not
permission for.
easy because
Sounds like a swap.
Singapore started with a clean slate. You know, the government doesn't have
And-
land
and the
bank.
government
The
starts with half a
developers
dozen tycoon
have the
families.
land bank. They have the land bank. The four big families, they have the land bank. We don't. You know.
Well, architects say that there are brownfield sites that could easily be used to quickly build cheap public housing, and the trouble is, of course, the tycoons also keep the cost
No.
of construction as
Actually,
well as.
several families are already offering lands.
But that just sounds like a sort of charity kind
But
of thing.
it's not just resumption of land. You also need to work out a transport system. If you live in new territories, you know the East Rail, West Rail, all saturated.
If there's one thing the government ought to be able to do, I'm sure it's transport. Questions, please, from the floor here. You, sir. And you next.
Let's say that Carrie Lam resigns. What's next? And most importantly, who's next?
Carrie has said that she's not allowed to resign. And whoever is next will inherit a big mess. No.
Well, I would very love if Carrie Lam resigned, and then we'll have real universal suffrage to elect our chief executive. I always think that Regina Ear is the victim of not having universal suffrage because she herself tried to elect last time, but she wasn't even nominated. I
Well-
believe if we have universal suffrage,
Yes.
you have very good chance.
Well, that's what I told the U.S. senator I met last Saturday. You know?
Did they doubt your loyalty? What was it?
No.
You, please.
So this evening, we've really heard from a wide range of opinions, both for what's going on and against, for violence, against violence. But I think something everyone in this room can agree on, and even you guys on the panel, is that we all love Hong Kong. We wouldn't be fighting for Hong Kong from one end or the other end if we didn't love it, and that's something I think we can really find unity on. So in that spirit of loving Hong Kong, loving the city, from the food to the culture, just every person in Hong Kong, where do you hope Hong Kong is in maybe 1 year or in 2 years?
Maybe all of you please answer, starting with Bonnie.
Well, as I said, Hong Kong people are only reacting to the police brutality, reacting to the government totally being irresponsive to Hong Kong people. So this question really should be answered by Regina here, who is also a member of the chief executive. Please, please, please do not make any more bad strategy, not any more big moves, because ever since mid-June, all the moves that the government had given to Hong Kong people actually make things worse. Actually, we would have been go home happily and sleep in mid-June if the government had withdrawn the bill.
Thank you, Bonnie. Here's to some sleep, because there's a lot of very tired people with these protests. Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would hope that things calm down and we have a restoration of peace and order in Hong Kong. But I think most importantly that the government give the people what they're asking for, which I think, as Regina quite well pointed out, is nothing more than what the basic law is offering them. And I hope that we get there.
Thank you. And Regina, a year's
Well,
time.
the 2014 package is still on the table. It was rejected by the Democrats, you know. And I hope next year there'll be a new start. You know, I must be careful what I say, you know. I must be careful what I wish for, frankly. There could be a new administration. With the new administration, there could be a new start, new policies to redistribute, to deal with the land problems, to give the young people greater upward mobility, to mend the relationship between the police and the community, and even more importantly, between Hong Kong and our country.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I mean, that is a mildly hopeful point on which to end. The discussions after this event, might bring out less hopeful scenarios from some of you. But for now, could I please ask you to join me in a big round of applause for Bonnie, Anthony, and Regina. And extremely glad that you all came together. And I think more of this dialogue between government and others is really essential, and it's something that possibly Hong Kong has been missing. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, we've been incredibly lucky to have the Peel Street Poets collective this evening. It's been a real treat, and it's been a change of rhythm. And they've been going for 10 years. Is that right, Akin? 14. 14. And they run workshops for the spoken word. So if any of you are interested in that, well, please be in touch with them. So, Akin JJ, the last of our Peel Street Poets, you're very welcome.
Now, this poem I wrote for a world in turmoil.